my science communication that I have done in the past has been along the lines of papers and seminars and communication to other scientists. And where I've done any media, it's always been about my own research, so I felt very comfortable to talk about that. And generally, I don't do a lot of outreach. It's never really been a high priority for me. And a few months ago, that changed. It became a priority. And I think the reason for that, if I'm to be brutally honest with you, it's because I have an irrational fear of global pandemics. So, you know, some people are afraid of snakes, some people are afraid of spiders, and me, I fear global pandemics. So, you know, so when Ebola was taking off, I was nervously biting my fingernails and watching that, and SARS and the swine flu and various other things. And so, as a consequence of this weird and irrational fear of mine, I have, you know, I guess I follow a few networks of people who share similar irrational fears. And so I guess I've been watching coronavirus since, I guess, early January or mid-January. And then this tweet appeared on my Twitter feed, and I thought, oh, this is actually going to get very serious. This is probably the one that's going to turn up here. And then 2 days later, our first case was reported in Melbourne. At that point, I wrote to our OH&S people in the school, and I said, I think the school and university needs to pay careful attention to this one because it's on its way, and we should be thinking about what we're going to do. And so that's, I guess that's my background is that it's essentially that I have this weird irrational fear of global pandemics. I still maintain it's probably an irrational fear, but that just happens to be one that has happened this year.
What are you doing?
So I don't know.
Oh, sorry, sorry. I'm sorry, I
yeah.
didn't mute it. My child is in the room. Sorry.
So fear, you know, fear as an emotion, it needs an outlet. And so I guess the other thing I should share is that I am on a last year of my future fellowship at the moment, and I've taken a leave from campus to sit here and write a book. And so I'm writing my book, and I keep coming back to this wonderful map that Johns Hopkins Uni put out. At the time that I was looking at it, all of these big dots all across the world didn't exist, and it was pretty much just here. And I've been checking in on that, and I noticed down the bottom there that they've got, that, you know, they had made their data available, and they were talking about where they got the data from, and they've made it available as a Google Sheet. And so one afternoon, because I couldn't think of anything useful to write, I just you know, connected to their data set and started playing around with it. On the 7th of February, I made this plot just out of interest, which was, you know, the distance from Hubei, and the circles represent the size of the caseload as you go different distances from Hubei, and the y-axis here is the case fatality ratio, so the mortality rate. And I was intrigued as to why it was sitting up around about 40% mortality in Hubei, and was clearly much lower everywhere else in the world. But you can see that at this point in time, there was pretty much all of the cases were in China, but there had just started to trickle out some cases across the rest of the world. And so I kind of, you know, I'd done that for no particularly good reason, and was just continuing to watch it on this dashboard. By around about mid-February, however, well, a couple of things happened. Firstly, I came down with the flu and was laid out in bed with coronavirus-like symptoms for the best part of 7 or 8 days. And I was intrigued that at that point, my doctor was not interested in testing anyone for coronavirus that had those symptoms, and that you know, unless I had been overseas or been in obvious contact with someone who had been overseas, then I wasn't to be tested. And this was despite the fact that, for example, I was spending quite a bit of time at UWA, which is a fairly fluid part of the world. So, so I thought that was a bit intriguing, and you know, I guess having a flu, I was all of a sudden reminded of how awful it could be. So a combination of that and looking at the data, I really started to feel like my irrational fear was becoming a legitimate concern. And it was very clear that Italy was in very big trouble already. and looking at Spain and France and the UK, the signs were not looking good by mid-February. And I was listening to the media, and I was a bit concerned that the conversation was about a month behind where it needed to be. And I guess I was intrigued as to why everyone wasn't as worried as I was. And I thought about it for a while, and I thought, well, actually, there's probably three reasons for that. The first is that we're not kind of cognitively equipped to have an intuitive feeling for how exponential growth works. So, it's a very simple mathematical model. We can show it on paper. We can show it on a chessboard with grains of rice. But as using our kind of fast thinking capacities, we tend not to have a very good way of dealing with exponential growth. So my feeling was that most people weren't aware of what was likely to happen in the very near future. The second issue I had that was very real in my mind, but I realized was just probably just happening in my mind, was the fact that, because I do lots of field work, ecological field work, I know that you never see all of the things you go out to look for, and that detection is a major issue. And so I knew that the case numbers being reported were likely to be a very small proportion of the actual true caseload. And so the numbers were misrepresenting possibly quite a lot how bad the problem was. And I became increasingly frustrated with the daily media cycle because every day I would hear, there's been a jump in the number of coronavirus cases in insert name of place. It's the largest jump we've had so far. And that was the story every single day over and over again. And for me, that wasn't a story, and it wasn't particularly surprising because that's the nature of population growth. And so from that, I guess from thinking about those three problems as being, this was why I was concerned, and I wasn't seeing that concern being reflected in the public domain, I started thinking quite seriously about trying to get that message across to people. And so from that, this 10-day forecast idea was born. I used my reasonably extensive knowledge of R, my very rudimentary knowledge of Shiny for R, to make a little website, and I dropped it out on Twitter and said, well, here's this thing, it might be useful, and if anyone could help me, that'd be great. And so that was the gist of it. I think at that point in time there was quite a vacuum of good information out there beyond the media reports of we've had more cases than we had yesterday. At that point in time, we're kind of here on this graph rather than all the way up here. And so you can see on this graph at this point, we're looking at very straight lines on the log scale, and everything was just tracking at near perfect exponential growth. So the website, I was a little bit uncomfortable about the website because the things that I'd put out there, the numbers I put out there, were not the kind of normal, careful, full statistical analyses that I might normally put together for a scientific paper or whatnot. They were very much heuristics. Just like, here are some very basic statistics about the way this virus or this pathogen works, and using those basic numbers, we can come up with some very simple heuristics and give us a rough idea about what's going on. So the active cases is straightforward. So the data we have from Johns Hopkins University is a cumulative number of infections and cumulative number of recoveries and deaths over time. And so to get active cases, which I thought was the more interesting case, because I thought it'd be really nice if we could actually watch these things dropping rather than just running up to an asymptote. You just take the number of infections minus the recoveries and deaths. And so for the 10-day forecast, so this is just looking forward 10 days into the future, I used the simplest population model possible, which is just a simple exponential model. Detection, I said, well, we know that it takes about 17 days for someone to go from onset of symptoms to death. And so if we look at the death rate today, or the number of deaths today, sorry, that should be new deaths today rather than DT, and we divide it by the death rate, that should tell us how many new infections we had 17 days ago. realise I've written this out completely wrong as I'm talking through it. But it's essentially the number of new deaths today divided by the case fatality rate should give you the number of infections, new infections that there were 17 days ago. And so a rough estimate of detection would be the number of detected infections 17 days ago divided by the number that you would expect, right? So that was the detection estimate. As I said, apologies, I've written it out completely wrong. And then once you have a detection estimate, that you can also get an estimate of the true case numbers at that point in time. So very, very much heuristics, very much rough numbers, and I have to say it was uncomfortable for me to put those out there, but they were useful, and I tried to make it a transparent process. So the website went out, and then I did some shouting essentially. I made some noises on Twitter, and I made a few noises on LinkedIn, which is not a platform that I have used very often. And there was quite a lot of positive feedback from that process. So certainly lots of my colleagues said it was very useful. It was the kind of information that they had been wanting to see, unsurprisingly. But the thing that surprised me, I think, was the reaction on LinkedIn. I think that platform is much more targeted towards the corporate world. You know, this one post that I put out had 9,500 views, and I was all of a sudden getting lots of emails from the corporate sector saying this is really useful. Thanks for putting it out. So lots of emails from CEOs of various companies, ANZ. Anyway, lots of different places all of a sudden saying this is a really useful thing. I think at that point in time there was lots of people realizing that they needed to make some kind of decision that this might be going to happen, and then just this little 10-day vision of what the future might hold was very useful for them in making those decisions. I didn't have any tracking up on the website because I put it together in a flying hurry, so I don't really know how many people looked at it or were using it. At that point in time, it was just the website, and I had a link to a blog post that gave a pretty rough description of the methods. But the blog post, at least I could see how many people had looked at that. I did that the other day. It was in the first few weeks. It was was read by just under 12,000 people. And I think something crazy like 1,800 people went and looked at the code even, because I put the code up on GitHub. And I used a basic Shiny Apps account to host the website, and I had to upgrade that continuously because the number of people using the site kept crashing it. So I'm guessing that in those first 2 weeks, about 30,000 people used the site, and that's a rough guess. I think also that people were using it very often. People were looking at it a lot. The other thing that happened in those first 2 weeks was because I tried to put this out very much as a community project. It's like, here's this thing, if you would like to help, that would be great. And so a few people did actually get in contact with me. A fellow called Matteo Tomasini from University of Michigan, just a guy I met at a conference a few years ago, who happens to be very good at R and population dynamics. He got in contact and gave me a bit of help at the beginning. Dan Bolnick got in contact and gave me a bit of help. Alison Hill from Harvard, who's like a proper epidemiologist, she had put together a Shiny app that did SIER model for coronavirus, and we kind of stopped working on my site and switched across to working on her site through GitHub to try and there was a few weeks there where we were trying to essentially get her site to have a drop-down menu that you could select a country and all the parameters would populate forward for the model in that country. That is still a work in progress, but it's kicked off a whole bunch of really interesting conversations. Amy Herford from Newfoundland University, she helped me a lot with managing the Shiny App server, and Ian Marshner at University of Sydney, also a biostatistician, specialising in, I believe he specialised in epidemiology. He came up with a really fascinating analysis, which we managed to work into the website eventually. So I guess putting it out there, particularly putting it on GitHub and being very open about the fact that this was a work in progress, it actually did attract some very useful help from some good people. And then the University of Melbourne Cavalry came to the rescue, which was fantastic because I was starting to run out of ideas. So the media office came along. Andrew Transon took my blog post, edited it slightly, turned it into a pursuit article, and that got a lot of attention. I think it's had just over 70,000 looks, or whatever you call it, page loads since it went up. But probably the most important thing that article did was it brought to the attention of our colleagues over in Science IT, Melissa and Uli, that this project was here and it was part of the University of Melbourne, and we were trying to make it work. And Mel came along, I think she collared Uli and said we should go and help this poor benighted soul who clearly doesn't know anything about programming. And they've come along and offered just spectacular help in making the website much more functional, much more interesting, much better looking, and a part of the University of Melbourne environment. So I guess myself and Mel and Uli are now essentially the core development team and maintenance team for the website now. It's been a lot of fun working with both of them. So since then, the website's had many refinements. It looks very different. Obviously, it looks much more like a University of Melbourne site. Again, thanks to Mel, who pretty much had to rewrite all of the HTML code behind the University of Melbourne website to make it work with the Shiny server. So if anyone needs to do that now, Mel knows how to do it. We moved the plots across to Plotly and various other things. And probably the most useful thing we've done is we've also added state level drill down for a few countries for which we have the data. So the site gives, again, just using this exponential, simple exponential projection gives you an idea about where cases are going to be in the next 10 days. Because the exponential model is clearly breached as the growth rates are changing over time, rather than fit a more complicated model, we may do that soon, but rather than fit a more complicated model, I said, what you could do is just look at the growth rate over the last 3 days instead of the last 10 days to make your projections, and so you get a sense of how much the change in growth that we have achieved, I guess, or you've achieved in your country is dropping the expected number of cases in the future. So the website does that, and I think importantly, it also gives a sense of how many cases might not have been detected in the country, and the detections are broken down into a couple of categories. One is undiagnosed. This number is actually wrong. I have to look at that at some point. And undetected. So undetected were the class of cases that I described to you with the heuristic that I was looking for. And Ian Marshner's analysis was more looking for the cases that were going to be diagnosed ultimately, but haven't yet been diagnosed because the patients haven't become symptomatic yet. And his analysis is actually really cool way of getting at that. So there's two classes of non-detected cases that we can get at roughly with app. And this one's particularly useful when you have an outbreak, for example. Your detection level in the country or the region might be quite high, but you have a little outbreak. They start to appear in the undiagnosed category, and you can watch them declining over time as the outbreak gets caught. So it's pretty interesting. Anyway, so there's been lots of refinements to the site, and it continues to be used. So one of the things that Mel did was installed Google Analytics, so we actually get some idea about who's using the site. And this is active users since we launched the University of Melbourne version of the site. So it's continuing to rise. What's happening though is the use of the site's slowly dropping over time. And it's not so much the users dropping as people are coming to look at it less often now. So where people were coming to look at it every day there early on, people are coming to look at it, it looks like more like once a week or once every 10 days or so. So I think as the sense of panic starts to subside, there's a sense that we're actually starting to get on top of this epidemic. People are using the site less, which is great. I had, my initial thought about the site was that it would be used primarily just to show people what happens if we don't enact social distancing or we don't do anything. But I'm now finding that people are using it to get a sense of how well their country is tracking towards flattening the curve or suppressing the epidemic altogether. Now, I wasn't really sure about this audience and what you would be interested in. That's the backstory to the website, but I just thought I'd throw a few reflections in. Firstly, on the technical side, for those who are interested in such things, all of this is run by these 4 pieces of tool, I guess. There's R sitting there doing the data organization and analysis in the background. R Shiny, which lets R talk to HTML. I've been using RStudio as an integrated developer environment. I don't believe Mel or Uli use that, so that one's completely optional, but I've come around to RStudio in the last couple of years. I think it's really good, so that's what I use. And then GitHub has just been awesome. I've learned a lot about GitHub and Shiny in the process of putting all this together. I'd only ever used Shiny once before. GitHub I've been using as a kind of local repository manager, but I've never actually used it for collaborative software development. Now I see how that works, and it's really awesome. So with a little bit of technical knowledge, you can put this kind of stuff together. At least to the point where people who actually really know what they're doing, like Mel and Uli, can come along and provide you with a lot of help. And I guess the other technical tool to some extent was Twitter and LinkedIn, just for getting a little bit of attention to the project. And after that, things kind of took care of themselves to some extent. So for those of you who are interested in kind of data-driven science outreach, it's pretty useful to have a network on Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook, whatever it is you use, that you can make aware of what's going on. I think it's been interesting to me to think about the whole scientific response to coronavirus. I think the scientific response has been astonishing, and I think the entire world has turned to science for a solution to this pandemic, and I think it's a proud moment to be a scientist, I guess, in that regard, in that it's very clear that science was going to be our way of dealing with this, and people the world over have heeded the messages that have come out of science, and of course, it's astonishing to see how fast the genome got done and how fast the process of putting vaccines together has come together. And I think the scientists around the world have been working very, very hard to deal with this pandemic. But I also think to some extent we've been a little bit slow. I think that's worth pointing out. This quote from Michael Ryan on the 15th of March, who's the executive director of the World Health Organization. I think he was expressing some frustration at leadership in countries about taking action early. But I also read this to some extent as some frustration being expressed towards scientists, and I think in particular, epidemiologists being slow to get information out to the public and out to leaders, because epidemiologists everywhere were working very hard to make very complicated models work and make sure that they were right. And I think one of the things I'd noticed was a complete silence for what felt like a very long time. It was probably only 3 weeks from epidemiologists, while they all sat down and looked very hard and tried to make stuff work in a hurry. So they're all working very hard, but in the meantime, the communication was probably not there, and I think that was the vacuum that I guess was filled to some extent by the very simple 10-day look into the future that our site was making. So I think, you know, the only thing I would say is that you know, I really think the scientific community has done an incredible job and continues to do an incredible job. But there was a moment there where everyone was so busy trying to work out what they needed to do, and as well as that, you know, dealing with moving teaching online and, you know, various other things, that there was this little moment where lots of scientific communication needed to be happening, but there wasn't a lot happening. I also think this thing that Michael touched on, this fear of failure, is a very real thing. I felt very uncomfortable putting this website together. I felt very uncomfortable because I felt it was too simple. I was very concerned that some of the forecasts might be wrong, and some of them have turned out to be spectacularly wrong. I was concerned that I might lose some face with my colleagues who would look at this and say, Jesus, Phillips can do a better job than that, you know, like, and it's true. I could fit more complicated statistical models, and I could fit more complicated growth models to these data, and I could, but all of that takes time. And my feeling was very much that I was very much, as it turned out, aligned with what Michael Ryan was about to say, which with the speed at this point was very important. So I think there are times when it might be okay to actually say, oh, look, this is, just be very clear, this is rough, but this is kind of what things are looking like. We'll make this better as we go along. And I guess the platform that we've come up with here, which is a dynamically updated website, it updates every day, and we continue to work on it. We can continue to make those, we can pick up little errors that are here and there, and we can improve things as we go along. And we're just being very explicit about that this is a work in progress, and we continue to make it better as time goes on. I guess another reflection I've had is I've had lots of positive feedback from colleagues, and that's helped me feel comfortable about this. But I've also regularly asked myself why I was doing this and why one of my many other very competent colleagues wasn't doing this. And I think the answer to that is just very prosaic, that all of my colleagues were absolutely flat-strapped busy dealing with the impact of coronavirus on their teaching and their research. And I just happen to be in a little moment where I've largely not got a lot of research going on. I don't have a lot of students at the moment. I'm supposed to be writing a book, and I can put the book aside and do this. And so just pure dumb luck that I'm sitting there with the capacity to actually not be swamped by the huge amount of work that just the arrival of a pandemic has imposed upon everyone. So that's my kind of weird little reflections on the scientific response. The public response, I think, has been absolutely incredible, particularly in Australia. I think Australia as a country should feel very proud of its response to coronavirus. I think people from individuals, businesses, state and federal governments have made very, very difficult decisions, and people have paid all sorts of costs taking this seriously. But I think the data show that we have acted just in the nick of time, I think, in Australia, and that we're now possibly one of the best spots in the world in this country, which is wonderful, and I think, even on the global level, it's astonishing to see what I marvel at human ingenuity. I think this is the growth rate over time across the entire world, aggregated across the entire world. You can see straight away that my exponential model is clearly wrong, because the growth rate is changing very, very rapidly. But it's astonishing to watch the way that humans can learn, be warned, and adapt to something like this. And yeah, so at that point, that's pretty much all I have to say. I think the public's been amazing, and I think I've largely done my acknowledgements as I've gone along. So I think I'll just stop there and hand over to Mick.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ben. Are there any questions? So when I spoke to Mick before, we said there is some scope for questions now. If you want to raise your questions via the chat app, that might be helpful, but there's plenty of time to ask Mick and Ben questions later on at the end of Mick's talk. But are there any sort of urgent questions? Please feel free to type away.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks, Ben. I remember actually in the days before going to see Harry Potter, I was actually using your website to sort of see how many cases are we likely to have in Australia, and are we going to get shut down and I won't be able to see Harry Potter at the theatre. I got there by 2 days. But I do want to just, it sort of touches on Luke Holman's question. I do want to say I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm a population biologist. I mess around with population models a lot. And this seminar won't be about oil economics, so it will be about the disease. And my interest in looking at the data on COVID, it's probably a little bit different from Ben. He was driven by fear. I guess mine was almost driven by hope, because I was thinking about, can we see changes in the trajectory of infection rates over time, and essentially departures from that exponential model that Ben was talking about. So it was driven by graphs like this. This is the Financial Times image, which is really become really popular for tracking cases. And I started thinking, well, what would we actually look for as we started getting some control of this disease? So I went back to the SRI model, and this is just showing the number of susceptible individuals and the rate of change of those with respect to time, driven by the proportion of the population that's susceptible. So in the early phases of an epidemic, this is essentially equal to 1, and then the number of infected individuals. And then we have recoveries, which in this model also includes deaths, which is a little bit, I guess, inappropriate, but that's the way it's modeled. Individuals removed from the infectious stage, again, just as proportional to the number that are infected. And then the number that are infected, the rate of change of those is driven by essentially those two dynamics. Now, early in the stage, early in an epidemic, S is approximately equal to N, as I mentioned. So we get a model that looks like this. And then the key one here is the number of infected individuals, or the rate of change of that, is just proportional to I. And this is what leads to that exponential growth. And so we're expecting the number of infected individuals to change exponentially with time, because the rate of change is just proportional to the number that are infected early in the epidemic. We also are expecting new cases to be proportional to the number that are infected. And so then I started thinking, well, let's look at how the number of new cases is changing over time. And then what we're trying to do through our controls imposed by the government and hopefully followed by people is to essentially see changes in this parameter beta, which changes then the number of new infections that are occurring. So I started thinking, let's try and look at basically the number of new cases per day, which you might be thinking of as at least approximately this derivative, divided by the number that are infected. Because the disease has an incubation period of around about 5 days, it obviously varies from person to person, I thought also the number that we see in a particular day really should reflect the number of people who are infected 5 days ago. So I started looking at data like of those. And so this is what it looks like in Australia over time. This is Harry Potter, when I went, was just about here. And so we had very high rates of infections, number of cases per day per existing number of cases from about 5 days ago. And you can see a big reduction in that. And basically when I went to Harry Potter, it was let's all go to the football. And then a couple of days later, we started seeing some social distancing being brought into Australia, or being imposed in Australia. The other thing I was interested in is just thinking about, from the recovery point of view, is just how does this rate of infection actually compare to the number, or how does the number of people getting infected compared to the number of people recovering? And obviously to control this disease, we need the number of new infections to be less than the number of recovered. So then I started thinking about where does this value need to get to? Well, let's look at that same parameter, but now in terms of recovery per existing case. And that's what it looks like here. It's pretty variable data, but it's typically around about 0.05, which is suggesting that it takes around about 20 days for people to go from being infectious to recovered. And so once this rate of new infections gets below around about 0.05, then we start seeing a reduction in the number of infected individuals, and we've been below that level since around early April. I also started thinking things are going well in Australia. I started thinking about, oh, how are things progressing in other countries? In other countries, they don't necessarily have good data on the number of existing cases, they only have the total cases. So instead of looking at new cases per existing, I looked at new cases per total as a way to scale them. Well, before I get to that though, we do have data at a more local level. And so this is just within New South Wales. And that previous data includes infections that have arisen from people arriving from overseas after they've been infected from overseas. So what I was looking at is trying to get a lot of the social distancing that was being brought in was to try and control the local infection rate. So what I did was I took these local data for New South Wales and Victoria, which are the highest number of cases in Australia, and then subtracted out the imports, both from interstate infections and also international infections. And you see also a good reduction in that infection rate at the time for New South Wales, and you see the same in Victoria. Also, you can see that this is reduced over time, and if you just overlay the timing of various restrictions, this is when we had the first sort of ban on the number of people who could be in gatherings, plus 10 days. So that came into effect on the 16th of March. So this is on the 26th of March, 10 days later, that's when that came in. Then a few days after that, we closed our borders, had limits on the density of people in indoor spaces. Then with, again, our stay-at-home order came in, and this is again with a 10-day delay. And then we also had gatherings of a maximum of 2 people. And the reason I was putting in a 10-day delay is that's around about how long it takes for people to develop symptoms, get tested, or get sick enough that they go and get tested and then get the test result. It's around about that time frame. And so this emphasises to me that any signal we see in our change in physical distancing will really have quite a lagged effect. And whether it's a 10-day lag or a 7-day lag or a 14-day lag, I think it's hard to really be sure, and it obviously varies from person to person. But I think that there is certainly a lag of the order of a week or two before we even start seeing changes in the data, and then we probably need about a week of data to really be sure what's going on. And I think that's relevant for when we start easing restrictions. We'll still have a similar sort of lag of around about 2, maybe even 3 weeks before we've got really good data to have a sense of what the new infection rate is going to be. The other thing I'll say, these efforts that were brought in through physical distancing are obviously important. I think one thing that's been very good in Australia has been the contact tracing, and that's basically getting a handle on who an infected person has been in touch with and then testing of those people. That's been quite good in Australia, partly because there's been a lot of resources put into it, but it's a lot of resources per number of infected individuals in the population is really high. If we think about some other countries, what I'm doing here is showing that new case per capita of each of the different countries, and rather than plotting against time, I've just plotted it against the total number of cases that have existed in those countries. You can see Australia here is close to 0, and we've got on the order of about 7,000 cases. Sweden's an interesting one. They don't have a mandated lockdown. They're just asking their citizens to practice as much physical distancing as possible, but they still have restaurants and cafes open and the like. They've got a infection rate at around about 0.05, which would lead to a relatively low growth in the number of existing cases. It would probably be fairly stable over time. And if it stays at about 0.05, I'd expect this would keep tracking essentially horizontally. We've got this cluster of European countries that are really on a very similar trajectory to each other, Spain, Italy, and the UK. And also looked at the US, partly because at one point the Vice President, Mike Pence, said he thought the US was tracking like Italy, and I thought, I don't think so. I think you're probably a lot worse than Italy, and this shows that it is. And they're on the way towards 1 million confirmed cases, and there's probably, although hard to know for sure, but likely to be millions, maybe 1 or 2 or even 3 or 4 million other unconfirmed cases in the United States as well. So where these sort of worms go is fairly hard to tell. It's hard to tell. I think if any restriction, well, relaxing of restrictions in the US happens, we'll expect to see that growth rate to go up, but it will take probably 2 or so weeks after the relaxing to see that data. The other thing I was thinking is trying to get a handle on this and how long it would be towards recovery. We have, if beta and gamma, these parameters are constant, then the number of infected individuals will be exponential with respect to time. And that also means essentially the number of new cases will also be exponential with respect to time. But if we look at the number of active cases, some of the data is actually a little disappointing, or at least the publicly available data is a little bit disappointing. This is taken from Ben's website. And so the data that's available for that doesn't really track recoveries very well for New South Wales, for example. So it's very difficult to use the number of active cases of very small jurisdictions to get a good sense of how the epidemic is progressing, or in that case of New South Wales, improving. So if we think about I being exponential with respect to time, we also expect the number of new cases to be exponential with respect to time as well. And so that means that we can actually track the number of new cases and look at the change in that to also get a good handle on that. This is what it looks like in the US, and this is why I'm particularly worried about what's going on in the US at the moment. Essentially, the number of new cases per day is pretty flat. The cycling here is just through the weekly cycle of testing. They do less testing around the weekends. But it's not going down particularly quickly, and so if there's relaxing of social distancing in the United States, we'd expect the number of new cases to increase substantially, and that will flow through to the number of deaths per day as well. Things are improving in Italy. It's one of the other countries with had major problems, but you can see that this decline is really quite slow. And if it is going to decline exponentially, they're likely to have a number of new cases per day being quite large for quite some time yet. And I think part of the problem is, when you get 3,000 new cases per day, or in the case of the United States, 30,000 new cases per day, doing that contact tracing becomes very difficult. In Australia, we're down to around about 10 cases per day. And I've put it on a log scale here because just as you get exponential increase, you get exponential declines when the number of susceptible individuals is still very large in the population. And so if you did project that out using an exponential function, you'd be looking at around about 1 new case per day, maybe in about a month's time in Australia. Obviously, it starts getting difficult to project a month out because all sorts of things can change, and also the data here become more and more variable with much smaller numbers of individuals. You can even go to a smaller jurisdiction. Here's the data for Victoria, and this excludes imported cases as well. And I fitted the exponential curve to the last couple of weeks of data here. And even here, though, it sort of suggests that the tail is actually fatter than exponential. And so we may well be getting a few new infections occurring even with our current social distancing for quite a lot longer than the exponential model might actually suggest. So I'll just finish there by just reflecting on a few things that are on my mind. One is all of this is around symptomatic cases. There's been a little bit of work from the Doherty and Nick Golding, who was a former postdoc in the quantitative and applied ecology group in BioSciences, has been deeply involved in trying to estimate, well, what fraction of the symptomatic cases are we detecting in Australia, and it seems to be very high, probably over 75% and maybe even very close or at 100%. But the asymptomatic cases are problematic, I think, and trying to manage those is obviously very difficult. So that's in the back of my mind, and also makes me think about the potential for a fat tail in that progression over time rather than exponential. I also am a little concerned that transmission rates in the depths of winter might actually be a little bit higher, which is common for a lot of respiratory diseases, and it might be the case for this as well. So the future in Australia might not be as rosy as we think, but hopefully we'll also be able to control transmission come winter. Detection of new outbreaks is difficult. So if we do get to the point where we're close to eradication, if there are new outbreaks, we need a lot of testing to be able to find those. And the testing in Australia is high at the moment compared to some other parts of the world, but it could probably be higher to try and detect those. But frankly, I'm very happy to be living in Australia. If you look, if this was an Olympic sport for controlling COVID-19, Australia is definitely on or near the podium. And I do worry about South America, Africa, and even places like the United States, which really should be doing better. Thanks for listening in. And if you've got any questions, I'm happy to chat now, or I'll hang around as well later to chat.
Thank you very much. Great talk again. So are there any questions? Please use the chat again. There's one question which I might put to both of you, which comes still from Ben's talk, is how do your models fare when you compare to Iceland, where we've got full testing? So what's the situation? Would you rather be in Australia than Iceland?
Ben, do you want to take that or me?
For both of you. So
I've never been to Iceland. Do they have good beer in Iceland?
It's okay. It's super expensive, and the national dish is half decayed shark meat and puffin. So it's just.
So to be frank, I'm pretty happy to be in Australia. I mean, I think Australia, New Zealand, Iceland, South Korea has had larger numbers, but they're managing it pretty well. About a month ago, people thought Singapore was doing really well, and they're having a major problem now, particularly in their dorms. So I think it's hard to be too comfortable, to be honest, because things can get out of hand very quickly.
Can I just jump in before there are further questions, just to mention that you've seen on the announcement, we had a plan to have a little drinks get together afterwards. So the plan was to take a little break, stretch legs, so on. And then those who are interested in chatting a bit more about these topics, the two speakers are happy to come and join us to sort of chat a little bit more. So if we don't have time to sort of get through questions, then hang on. We'll plan to resume at 4:15 on the same Zoom connection. But meanwhile, for people who have to go, we can have a couple of questions now, but just advertising that opportunity to ask longer questions later.
Okay. Yes. So, and Ben, did you have a chance to compare your forecast with the data from Iceland?
No. So short answer to that is no. I haven't even looked at Iceland. So no, I don't know. That's a good question though. I've written it down and I'm going to have a look.
Okay. There's mostly praise as far as I can see. One question is for Mick. Why are you doing this work? Is it supposed to inform decision makers? Who do you want to inform?
So I did it for myself initially. I haven't done it for decision makers. I did it for myself initially because I was guess I had a little bit of concern in my mind about where it was tracking, and I was also thinking, to what extent are we making a difference through the physical distancing? And I started trying to think through, when would we actually start seeing the benefits of that, and what would be a reasonable timeframe to see the benefits of that? So I was doing that for myself because of my level of concern and my curiosity. And then I thought, well, if I'm doing it for myself, I may as well just make that information publicly available. So I was really doing it to reach the public.
Okay,
and so I've had a little bit of work through, through that. I've been on 3AW a couple of times in the morning, and mentioned in the Herald Sun. Some of the work was mentioned in the Herald Sun. So it was really just to get people aware, and also them aware that we've actually done a really good job through, the major sacrifices that have happened, and just done a really good job compared to other places in the world as well.
Then, so one question which is quite tricky, I think, to answer, but your knowledge of the data might help you a little bit more. What are your thoughts on reports of reactivation among asymptomatic cases? Is that something which is noise in the reporting, or specificity, sensitivity of tests, or is that something which we should genuinely worry about a lot?
No, I'm a virologist or an epidemiologist, so I can't really say for sure. I mean, I've seen reports of reactivation. Some of those, I think, have been questioned about whether it's really just the disease didn't actually go away, or the fact that you find RNA doesn't necessarily mean that the virus is still active.